Hello and welcome to another episode of Quick and Nerdy with your host, Brandon McCoy, technical advisor here at Veeam Software supporting our Veeam cloud and service providers. And today we're going to talk about Veeam and Wasabi, how it integrates, how you can use it as a repository, and some really cool tips and tricks to make sure that you're getting the most out of your backups with Veeam using Wasabi. So we're going to start with just a quick look at the architecture. Now, as I do this video, we are in Veeam Backup and Replication version 11 and Veeam Agents version 5. In the next release of products, the requirements and the configurations for using object storage just like Wasabi are going to change. There's going to be a lot more flexibility and new options. But as it is today, this is the architecture we're dealing with. We're going to start with needing a Veeam backup and replication server. This can be at the Enterprise or the Enterprise Plus level of our product. You're going to need a local disk-based repository. So this would be the primary Veeam repository that you back up to first. Veeam has to back up to a disk first before it can be copied or moved to an object storage like Wasabi. Now, this local disk-based repository cannot store the Veeam configuration. So in your Veeam server, Veeam backs its config up on a small file. You need to make sure the repository that you're using does not contain that configuration backup for the scale-out repository that we'll talk about in a moment. The object storage bucket, so that's going to be your Wasabi bucket, or if you choose Amazon S3, Backblaze, they all have the same kind of architecture that we're talking about now, the scale-out repository. So if you're not using Wasabi, most of these instructions will translate over. Now your scale-out repository, this is a Veeam term, and this is two repositories that are presented to Veeam as one. So this could be two disks, maybe a computer and a NAS, or multiple volumes on a NAS, right? But in our case, it's going to be a local repository, some sort of disk, right? The Veeam server, a NAS, a USB hard drive. And we're going to add the Wasabi bucket to that and create a scale-out repository that consists of a local disk and a Wasabi bucket. So let's get into the software and we'll show you how it all works. So I think the first place to start is actually in Wasabi. So here I am at wasabi.com and I've created an account. Now I believe Wasabi will give you a 1 terabyte free trial for around 30 days if you'd like to try it out for yourself. But I've created my account here, and the first thing I want to do is I want to create a bucket. Okay, so if I click create bucket up here, we'll give this bucket a name. Keep in mind that these names are global, so it can't be a bucket that anyone in the universe has ever created. So we'll just call this Veeam backup bucket. Let's see if that's in use. Okay, so that one's good. Now I can select a data center region. If you'd like to know where these data centers are, you can look up the service URLs for Wasabi. As a matter of fact, when we enter this into the Veeam software, we are going to need that service URL. So this is something you should get familiar with. First of all, let's just decide what data center we want these backups to go to. So I'm going to pick US East 1, which is in North Virginia, right? So if I come back here, region, US East 1. Okay, I'll need to remember that information as well. Now before we click create bucket, there's two more things we're going to check. Okay, and that is bucket versioning and object lock. Now this is an optional thing you can do, but what this does is it allows Veeam to integrate with the object lock capability of object storage in S3 so that files sent there are read-only. They cannot be deleted, modified, encrypted for the specific amount of time that you choose. So we'll put in bucket logging, or I'm sorry, bucket versioning and object lock, and we'll just click next. Once we got everything ready, we click create bucket, and boom, we've got our bucket. Now before we add our bucket to the Veeam software, we're going to have to get ourselves an access key. So let's talk about that. So the access key is a programmatic API that allows Veeam to connect to your bucket and to make calls to that bucket to be able to read, write, delete, put things in that bucket, right? And it's really interesting because when we're adding this repository to our Veeam software, it's not asking for the username and password of the Wasabi account. It's just asking for that key. So that's going to play a very vital role in terms of immutability and ransomware proofing. So let's go down to access keys. You can see here I've already created a few. I'm not sure exactly how many you can have. I may need to delete one, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new access key. I'm going to use this for myself as a root user. If you'd like to learn a little more about root users and sub-users, you can Google that. Wasabi should have some more information on that. So here's the access key. Now I can always see this access key, but this secret key is only going to show me one time. After that, I can never get that secret key again. So definitely you're going to want to make sure you save this. I'm going to download this to a CSV file, and I'm also going to delete it once this video is over, so no funny business. All right, so I've got my key. I've created a Wasabi bucket, picked the data center region in which I'd like that bucket to reside, and I've also enabled the object lock and bucket versioning, which is going to help support immutability for ransomware proofing our backups. So let's dive into the Veeam server. Okay, so here I am in the lab. I've got Veeam backup and replication version 11 running, and if I come down to this backup infrastructure tab and I come to backup repositories, you can see I've already created quite a few of them. This is our production lab, so you probably won't see as much stuff here on the screen, but all you got to do is add a repository, and this will be your first local repository. If I click direct attached storage, maybe this is a Windows or Linux server, maybe it's the Veeam server itself, which is the repository by default. Maybe it's a NAS, so I have an SMB NFS share, right? So lots of options as long as the first repository is a disk. And I've already kind of added these. If you need more information or help on creating your first repository, that can be found in our Veeam Help Center. So assuming that you've already got your first local repository created, the next thing we do is we come back in and we add our Wasabi bucket. So Wasabi is going to be listed under object storage. And as of now, we consider this S3 compatible. I believe in the next version, it will have its name promptly displayed like some of these other ones, but S3 compatible. So we're going to give this a name. We'll call it Quick and Nerdy Bucket. Okay. You can limit the tasks that can be performed. So when we're offloading to object storage, if you have a lot of different backups that you're trying to go at the same time, you may want to do this to not saturate your links. Okay, so now it's asking for the account, and the account is going to be those service points that I mentioned, right? So quickly hopping back over to what are the service URLs for Wasabi? Well, remember, we picked US East 1, which is North Virginia, and the service URL is right here. So I'm going to simply copy and paste right here. The region was US East 1. I believe this is default on any one, so you may need to change it to East 2 or West 1, whatever account you have chosen or data center. Now for the credentials. So I'm going to add my credentials and see it's asking for the access key and the secret key, right? So I have got my CSV file somewhere out there. See if I can find that. Here we go. Okay. Make these a little bigger. So here's my access key. We'll copy and paste that. And then my secret key. Okay. A little bit bigger. There we go. Remember, keep that secret key handy because you can never retrieve it if you lose it. Okay, so I've got my access key and my secret key. I'm going to click OK. Now it says use the following gateway server. So if your Veeam server has internet access, typically it's just going to use that as the gateway server. That's to be able to offload into the cloud. If you have some stricter security network restraints, you may have to pick a specific machine that is allowed to have that communication to push off to the internet. Okay, we'll click next. If I did everything correctly, then I should get to this next screen, which I do. So, okay, bucket. We're looking for a bucket. Remember, we just created one. That was my Veeam bucket of backups. We'll click OK. And then for folder, typically it'll let Veeam create a folder for us. So let's just click New Folder. We'll call this Backups in the Cloud. Okay, click OK. Now I can limit the amount of data that I'd like to send to Wasabi. Keep in mind that Wasabi is unlimited pay-as-you-go storage, but if there's a reason you'd like to limit it, you can. Now, back to the immutability in the ransomware piece. Remember earlier we typed in object lock and bucket versioning. Because we typed in those two things, we are now able to make our backups immutable or ransomware proof for X number of days. A quick note here, if you did not enable versioning and bucket lock when you created the bucket, you cannot go back and change that. So you would have to create a new bucket if you wanted to take advantage of the immutability or ransomware proofing. So we're going to say make recent backups immutable for 30 days. This immutability period should coincide with your retention period, and I believe 90 days is the max amount of immutability you can have. We'll click apply. Give this just a second to finish saving its configuration. Okay, there we go. We're all good. So we've now got our Wasabi bucket, which is quick and nerdy bucket right there. Okay, I've also got my repository. It's the Veeam default repository. And keep in mind that when we create this scale out repository, you cannot use a repository that has your config file. If you need to check that, you can click this hamburger icon on the top left, click configuration backup, and we can see which repository the configuration backup is going to. Okay, so that will not be a viable option when I create my scale out repository. Okay, so just cancel here, and we're going to go to scale out repositories, and we're going to add scale out repository. Okay, and we'll call this Wasabi Repo Cloud. Okay, we'll click next. So the performance tier, this is going to be our local disk. You can have multiple local disks. Again, this was the original intent of the scale out repository, is multiple Veeam repositories presented as one. I'm just going to add this single local repository. That's my performance tier. That's where the backups have to land first. The placement policy really only matters if you have multiple disk-based repositories. We can decide where the full backups and the incremental backups go. For this video, and when we're just using one local repository and a Wasabi bucket or an object storage bucket, this placement policy doesn't matter. So we're just going to click next, and we're going to go down to capacity tier. So capacity tier, this is going to be my Wasabi bucket, my object storage. Now a quick note, Wasabi only has one tier of storage. Amazon and Azure, a few others, they have multiple classes of storage. So they've got your capacity tier for your standard S3 or your standard object storage, and then they have a cheaper tier known as an archive tier or AWS Glacier. That's going to be for very long-term backups. Wasabi only offers the one, so here we are at the capacity tier. Some of those other object storage vendors, you may see an additional option. So I am going to extend my scale out repository with capacity object storage, and this is the bucket we created earlier. Now if I check this box, copy backups as soon as they are created, I always like to do this. This satisfies my 3-2-1 rule. That means that any backup that goes to the local repository immediately gets sent off to the object storage repository. First the full, then the incrementals. And this way I've got a one-to-one copy of everything. Now I can also move certain backups to object storage and off of the local repository. So this is a good idea if you have maybe some weekly, monthly, yearly backups that are taking up a lot of space. You can have your local repository have maybe the first 14 days, the first 30 days. That'll also be copied in Wasabi, and then anything older than, in this case, 14 days, gets deleted from the local repository and either moved up to object storage for the rest of its retention, or if the backups were already there because of that copy mode, then we just update the metadata for the amount of time those backups are kept in object storage. Okay, so with this, we've pretty much finished creating our scale out repository with object storage. I do want to kind of focus on one last thing. So we're going to come out of here real quick, and I'm going to go to a backup job. And we're going to create some retention, and I want to point out a few things. I want to mention that the retention and the frequency of backups is always based on the job. So when you think about when does this go to Wasabi, how does it go to Wasabi, how long it stays there, that's all done in the scale out repository section, right? We're either copying the retention for one-to-one and or moving the retention to ride out in Wasabi for the remainder of its time, right? So think about it like this. The retention policy, I'm going to put to 30 days locally. Simple retention, that's one full in 29 increments. I'm going to click this Advanced tab. I've got some synthetic fulls periodically. You will have to create full backups periodically in order to move older backups off of the local storage. If I don't, then the backup chain is always dependent on the full backup. We call this forever forward. So basically, if there's no full backups checked in this Advanced tab, that's called forever forward, meaning that the full backup is always being used and moved up into the next spot as retention continues on. Because of this, we can't move any backup files to object storage even if we tell it to. So when we create a synthetic or an active full, that restarts the chain. Now I have a new full that can be used for the next increment to write to, and the original full and whatever increments up into that point can be moved to object storage. Okay, so I'm going to create a synthetic full on Saturday, and that synthetic full is going to be used to create my GFS policy, my weekly, monthlies, and yearlies. So I'm going to keep 4 weeks for the month, 12 months for the year, and 7 years, okay? Now, our GFS policies, you'll notice these are full backups, so we may want to move those off of local storage. So again, 30 days of simple retention. Every Saturday, I create a full, which first of all, restarts the retention, and everything behind that is now inactive and can be moved to object storage. And I'm using some of those weekly fulls, those synthetic fulls, as GFS markers. Keep this full for 4 weeks and 12 months and 7 years. And so if you remember on our scale out repository, we've got the copy mode. So 30 days local, 30 days in Wasabi. Anything older than 14 days gets moved up to Wasabi. So every second Saturday, when that second synthetic is created and it's been 2 weeks, anything older than that, so it should be day 15 through 30 on the local repository, will just be deleted. And all the rest of it has already been sent to Wasabi, and it'll just continue to ride out the retention until it is 7 years old. And with that, I want to thank you for tuning in to an episode of Quick and Nerdy. Feel free to leave any comments, questions. You can always reach out to me as well, brandon.mccoy@veeam.com, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.